time, I'd like to turn it over to Vic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Randy. And I want to thank my colleague Laura for all her support in getting this very important discussion together. So just to reiterate Randy's comments, welcome and thank you for joining us during this 1 hour, which is really intended to be a dialogue and a discussion, not a presentation, around where we headed next in terms of the impact of COVID, in terms of people impact, in terms of what it means to our mental well-being and beyond. So looking forward to this dialogue. What I also want to iterate from on behalf of our panelists and all of our colleagues at EY is that we sincerely hope that you and your loved ones are well and certainly in good spirits. That's first and foremost on our mind as we embark on this discussion. So thank you again for your time and joining us. We have a really esteemed group of panelists assembled today. We're so proud and appreciative of the panelists that we have assembled. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Anne first, and then David Roberts, and then my colleague Frank to introduce themselves. So Anne, might I hand it over to you?
Thanks, Vic, and hi, everyone. I want to, Vic, just thank you and the E&Y team for the invite today. For everyone else, I'm the head of human resources at Bristol Myers Squibb. Bristol Myers Squibb is a global biopharmaceutical company. Our mission is focused on bringing innovative medicines to patients. Patients are at the center of everything that we do at this company. They inspire us, and they're actually why we come to work every day. So I'm joining you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania today, and I look forward to our discussion. David, over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Vic, and everyone at EY for asking me to join. I am a pulmonary and critical care physician by training. I am Dean for External Education at Harvard Medical School. Many of you know Harvard Medical School is a place that trains physicians and scientists, but we also train a lot of folks just like you who work in companies, and we train people in companies through online learning. We have some amazing programs that are called HMX and HMX Pro, and we do executive education, teaching people about health and healthcare. And we have an entire health publishing arm, and we'll talk about many of those related aspects today, that provides information to the world on important topics like COVID and mental health issues related to that. So I'm joining you today from Wellfleet, Massachusetts, way out on the end of Cape Cod, and excited to participate and listen to all your questions and talk through the issues with you.
Yeah, and this is Frank Giampietro. So happy to be a part of this panel. My day job is as a partner in the people advisory practice at EY. And I have been very focused over the last several months on how employers are responding to COVID and the crisis that has ensued. And what's evolved for us in terms of the way we're supporting clients, which we think about in two gears, and kind of how do organizations safely return people to the workforce in what we refer to as physical return, and kind of a second gear, if you will, which is at the same time, through all of the challenges that we've had through the past several months, there's been some silver linings. And how do we reimagine what work can look like, leveraging some of those silver linings going into the future? So that's been a lot of my focus over the last several months, and hoping to share some of that in the conversation today.
Great. And again, so grateful to all three of you for joining us, and especially you, Anne and David, taking time out of your busy schedules to be here for this dialogue. What I want to start the discussion off with, and David, I'll start with you, but before we get there, just under the Human Element brand, for those of you who I think are familiar with our Human Element initiative, it's really around getting down to the N of one, right? So what impacts people that rolls up to the organizational aspects of any company that we're working with or for. So we really want to get to a little bit above the surface of what we've been talking about and what we've all been involved with and experienced over the last 4 months, coming up to 5 months, in terms of the impact of COVID, and really getting at the heart of the issue and going a little deeper to say, how does it impact our people? And how do we go beyond just saying, hey, are you okay? Like what's deeper to that? And what's the benefit of that, right? The benefit is that you're really getting at the heart of the issue. You're getting at the core of solving for perhaps issues that may be simmering in your organization down to the NF1 or even at the project team level. So what I encourage everyone, as Randy said at the start of the dialogue, is please use the chat function. This is intended to be a discussion, and think about those challenging questions that you yourself might be experiencing, your organization, your team might be experiencing. And we'd really like to sort of address those questions as best as we can. This is an evolving situation and an evolving experience for all of us. And I don't know if there's concretely any right answer, but certainly together and collectively, we can certainly discuss it and try to solve for it. So wanted to just stage the discussion in that fashion. Laura, might we move to the next slide, please? So David, I wanted to start the dialogue off with you. And, you know, I think about the term novel coronavirus, and the word novel is there for a reason, right? It's not there. It's meant to be that this is new. And I think as we sit as just people, not even as employees, there's so many facts swirling around us. There's so many differences in what we've heard yesterday or in March about the novel coronavirus. So might we just spend a couple of minutes grounding ourselves in the facts as we know them today, knowing that this is evolving, and then progress the discussion from there.
Sure. Thank you, Vic. And I do think it's very important for everyone to be on the same page with this. We have learned a tremendous amount in the last few months, and my colleagues in the health publishing arm of what we do have put together an amazing resource. If you just search Harvard Health and coronavirus via the web, you will get to more information than you can ever imagine. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize as we have seen this evolve over the last few months is that this is a disorder that we think is transmitted through respiratory interaction, meaning that this is a problem that you get from other people, from being close to them, being indoors, and breathing in particles that one person is releasing. So what do we know works, and what do we know limits the spread of this? It's not only good hand hygiene, meaning washing your hands. It means staying apart from each other, physical distancing, but it really means wearing masks. And there are some very good data that are coming out that really suggest, and there has been lots of confusion and there has been lots of changing, evolving advice on this. But I think it's very clear now that we know that wearing masks helps both you and everyone else. One of the issues that I'm sure everyone on this call is thinking about is, what is the future work environment look like? Can we get to a point where people are back inside, in offices? And I think that's a ways away. And I think, you know, one of the things, if you look at that list of symptoms there, we know there are not only people who don't have any symptoms, they are asymptomatic. And then we also know that there are people who are what are called pre-symptomatic. They may not have symptoms now, but they may eventually get them. And what we don't understand yet is who is someone who's at very high risk for spreading this and who is not. And that's why at this point, it's best to protect yourself and protect others, wearing a mask, hand hygiene, social distance, physical distancing. I think the point you made, Vic, about it being novel is that probably most of us had not spent a lot of time thinking about coronaviruses before January, February, March. The reality is these are very common viruses. The good news is that we have learned a lot, and my colleagues in this group called the Massachusetts Consortium on Pathogen Readiness have really combined a lot of information from our affiliated hospitals and from our scientists, and we're really learning leaps and bounds on a regular basis. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, David. No, I think it's a great grounding for us, and I think why don't we take what you said, right? You thank you for the facts, but I think you raised an important point, which is a good segue into the next piece of our foundational discussion, which is, you know, where we are today. We don't know when that return to work environment, you know, line of demarcation, if you will, is. So, Laura, if we could just move to the next slide. And Anne, might I turn to you? So you being the people leader at BMS, on some day in March, right? For us, it was March 14th or something around that time frame. You know, a light switch went on and off depending on how you look at it, and suddenly you needed to convert your organization into a virtual organization, and then progress from there onwards to where we are today. Could I ask you to, I think two questions for you, Anne. One is, could you tell me what that day felt like? What did you sense, right, when you realized that your workforce was going and your colleagues were going virtual? What did you sense personally? What did you sense for your colleagues? And then perhaps what has that journey been like over the last 4 months for you?
Gosh, it feels like yesterday and it feels like so long ago at the same time. And I know that doesn't make any sense, but it's seriously, that's reflecting right now. You know, I lead the COVID response team at BMS. And we got our first call from China sometime in January. I looked last night. It was just sometime during the month of January. We have a very large field-based sales operation in China. We also have a manufacturing plant in China. And our Chinese leaders started to reach out to our company head of our employee health services physician for advice. And that then triggered our business continuity plan that we have in place for the company. The business continuity team addresses hurricanes, fires, all natural disasters. So we triggered that, and we activated our crisis response team at that point in time. And this started it was late January, early February when we initiated the crisis response team. We call them the CERT, and I'm going to slip and call them the CERT, just so it's one of the same. Corporate Emergency Response Team is what that acronym stands for. As we were in the early days talking to our employees in China, we recognized this was going to affect our employees and our communities in a big way globally. And just when we appreciated the spread and the lack of understanding and how it was spreading, but really the speed at which it was spreading was alarming. And that's when we said, this is bigger than China, and we need to move very quickly on this. We learned really quickly that one size doesn't fit all, like there could not be a common response. It wasn't going to fit this situation because there were different government directives around the world, country by country, different local requirements. So we said, corporate can't just say, do this. That wasn't going to work. And so very early on, and I'm so glad we did this, we established two principles that kind of helped guide all of our decision making. And that was, first and foremost, we were making decisions that would preserve the health and the safety of our workforce. David, some of the things you spoke to, that's behind every decision that we made. The second decision was that we have to continue the supply of medicines to our patients. They're counting on us. They need their medicines. And so those were the two drivers we made going forward on who comes out of the workforce and who works remotely and how do we balance all of that. We, from the very first days, decided we were going to have transparent and frequent communications to our workforce. That has served us so well because we built trust from the very beginning there. And, we established, Vic, some phases. They're BMS phases. They only mean something, I think, in our language. The phases are red, orange, yellow, and green. There are definitions for them, but each of our countries, we call them markets, are in one of these phases. The United States is in red phase right now for us because of the obvious continued spread of coronavirus. So you asked me how I felt that day in early March as we were starting to, in particular, hear about the number of cases, the rise in Europe, and I remember Italy was really starting to be alarming, and we were starting to see the cases come to the United States. And we had made a decision. We started talking about this very early March, the first week of March. And I remember the first conversation I had with my CEO, it was a phone call. And I remember telling him, I think we might need to take our workforce out. This is spreading so fast, and you couldn't look left or right or know what your peers inside industry, outside industry was doing, because it was all just happening so fast. And you don't make decisions based on what your peers do either. It's just one source of the input. So we decided we were going to send our US workforce home in very early March. We were one of the first companies in the United States to do that. And only our red essential employees would stay. And those essential employees were mostly our manufacturing employees, the ones who were in our plants manufacturing products. So Vic, it was surreal to have that phone call with the CEO. It was, you know, if you take yourself back in that point of time, the TV was on nonstop. There was conflicting news and data points, so you didn't really know what was truth and what wasn't. And that's still a challenge that we have today because everything's changing. But we immediately took our workforce out. The majority of our workforce is still out. Just a few weeks ago, we did bring our lab workers back into our facilities, practicing so only 50% are here at any point in time because they need to be at their lab benches to do what they do. And we continue to talk to all of our employees on a regular cadence, keeping up that transparent communications, and obviously doing all the training around how to work remotely. Our CEO puts out a weekly video, very informal. I think he uses his iPhone. It moves sometimes when he talks, and it has really helped us to be, I think, more nimble and agile as a company. But the feeling I had was just surreal. And there are times I still feel like that. Like, is this just a movie I'm in? But it's the real deal.
Yeah. Thanks, Ann, for just making it so personal. And I think what I want to explore later with the panel is what you're speaking to, right? Which is there is this assumption that if you're a leader, you're instantly resilient and always constantly resilient. And there can be some debate around that. We're also people, and what I very much appreciate is your authenticity around, hey, all of this stuff was going on around me when I was sitting in whatever part of my house while I was speaking to my CEO about making a decision about my colleagues, right? It's just that vision is remarkable, and I think it's something that we've all experienced. And what I want to explore later is that very point that you raised, which is now that with the events and the resurgence around us, we don't see that end in sight. So how do we keep up that resiliency? I'm going to put a little pin mark in that, and we'll pick up on that. Frank, if I could turn to you, one of the things that Ann raised, which I thought was really interesting in what she led and experienced at BMS, was around communications, right? And what we're also going through, whether we realize it overtly or not, is a change experience, right? We're changing almost on a daily basis. We're changing since March. We're changing on a daily basis. I know you've been integral in what we've been doing from an EY perspective, both internally and with our clients and the return to work environment. Could you provide a little bit of color on that change piece that you've seen both in EY and in the market?
Yeah. And you mentioned the word earlier, and I think that's one of the themes of communication through this period is authenticity, Vic. The interesting thing about people being home is getting to see them in a very different environment. And I think, those leaders that have really excelled here are those that have embraced that and really been open to being, their true selves. So there's clearly a frequency of communication that organizations have been trying to get right. Early on, most organizations were very strong coming out of the gate with very frequent communication, knowing that the kind of information vacuum was going to be a real concern. And I think I really applaud how much organizations have learned through the years and how they've adapted to that. And I think really hit the mark on that. I think what's been a challenge is none of us anticipated this lasting so long. And so there was a cadence where in many organizations, and I'll take EY as an example, our CEO is communicating on a weekly basis in a very, kind of an hour-long webcast to, all of our partners with a fair amount of information. and then pretty detailed emails on a regular basis as well. And I saw very similar kind of cadence from a lot of our clients. At some point, then it was like, gosh, there's less to communicate, and how often should we keep this cadence, because people are being a bit overwhelmed by all of the live vehicles. And I think what's happened now over the last probably 6 to 8 weeks is a little bit of a pullback on communication and more of sort of a normal rhythm around that. But also a mixture of the media that people are communicating with, right? So again, I mentioned, and Anne, you mentioned sort of the regular videos. It's been such a great pivot to more of that media through this than just emails, right? So one of the other trends we're seeing is just the on-demand access to information. So while there was a strong focus on getting people together and sharing information real time, now what we're seeing is strong use of video, but more on demand, letting people access that when they want, and really creating more of on-demand knowledge centers for organizations, where it's not just here's a video, but here's a topic area. We're going to set up an information hub on well-being, and there's going to be a mixture of videos and some learning and some access to tools. And here's what we're going to do, in terms of information about what return to office is going to look like, and a hub around that. So I actually have been really amazed in an incredibly positive way on the most clients' ability to respond to this. And I think this is one area where I think we're going to be much stronger in the long haul based on the organization's ability to respond to this. And I think it's going to change the way we communicate on a go-forward basis.
Thanks so much, Frank. So now that we've got this foundational piece sort of established, I want to pick up on a theme that all three of you have actually touched on, which is just from a personal perspective, when this all started in earnest in March, but as you referenced, Anne, we knew about this certainly in January, right? I had this sort of perspective in my head, seeing what was happening in Italy and in other parts of the world, that, look, it's going to be tough for 3-4 months, but then there's going to be some semblance of normalcy. There's a line of demarcation, and of course it won't be what it was, December 2019, but there'll be some semblance of normalcy. The data and the facts, as David has expressed to us, show that at least in the US, and I know we have some global participation on this call, at least in the US, we know that it's going to be far longer than that, just based on the data and the facts, and how we're sort of backtracking on some of the openings that have occurred, and rightfully so, to protect our people. That being said, we've also sort of had this perspective that everyone, all of us, leaders and members of our teams, jumped in. We all stood up and we said, look, we're going to do this and we're going to get through this crisis. And I think in speaking with my clients, Frank, I think you'd agree, in the stories, Anne, that you've shared with me, everyone did a really good job of doing that, and have been resilient and have been really integrated in that endeavor. How do you keep that up, right? When now we know, at least in the US, that we don't know when that end in sight is. We don't know what that line of demarcation is for a semblance of normalcy. How do you keep that spirit up, both in your leaders and even further into the organization? And might I get your perspective on that? And David, I would love sort of more of a clinical angle from you, if I might, which I think would have undercurrents of this mental well-being that I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, Vic, what you said is so true. I think, at least in the United States, in our minds, we were like, if we can get through March, April, we all rescheduled our vacations to August, thinking, and now we're rescheduling or canceling the August vacations. And there's a little bit of a doom and gloom that's hanging over the organization now, seeing the trends that, again, are happening in the United States, so in around the world as well, but we're really seeing escalation in the United States. I think I'll just tell you what I do, because I don't think there's one answer that fits everyone. Everyone's unique needs are unique and different. But what helps me with the resilience part, sometimes it just feels like Groundhog Day, So you have to First and foremost, establish and keep a routine. And it doesn't have to be a fancy routine, but I make my bed every day. I get up, make my bed, shower, get dressed, eat breakfast. I make sure I eat lunch every day and I take a walk every night. And that's my routine. And in between, I work a lot. But that routine is really important because for myself, it gives me some semblance of control in a world where there's not a lot of control right now. And I like control. So this is especially hard for me. The second thing I do, and this one is really important, to me. It is so important right now with the remote workers to establish personal and work boundaries, to communicate what those boundaries are and to role model them. So, I've heard, are we working from home or are we living at work? We need to be working from home. And what that means is those boundaries are, and I can share some of mine, don't schedule a meeting with me from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time. That's my lunch and it's open because I want to eat, So everybody knows that. I talk about it, and I talk about it not because I need everyone to know my personal business, but I want them to know you can hold your lunch hour too and protect that so that you can sit with your family, your kids, take a walk, whatever you want to do in that time frame. So it's really important to put those boundaries up at the early part of the day. Later in the day, I'm finding that if you don't put the boundaries up, I can be on phone calls 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. And it's not because it's Asia. It's because the work day just extends. So I've put a hard stop on my day that way as well. And it's hard to keep the boundaries up, and it's up to me. And then the last thing I would say is just prioritization of work. You can't be true to the boundaries you put in place if you can't prioritize your work, because there's no way I can get my book of work done today in the boundaries I've set. So I've got to prioritize it and let what I don't get to slip to tomorrow, and be okay with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Ann. And I also want to thank you for allowing me to remove your boundary from 12 to 1 today for your lunch hour and you joining our panels. I do appreciate that.
I make exceptions for
Thank you. Thank you, Ann. David, can we pick up on that? But maybe I'm going to ask you a bit more of a direct question, which is, can we start with how do you define resiliency? Oftentimes we say these words, and I'm probably as guilty as anyone else. Hey, let's be resilient. But from your perspective, and certainly that clinical angle, David, what does resiliency really mean in this crisis?
Yeah, I think it's a great example, and sometimes we all know it when we see it. And I would say that Ann describes resiliency well. She is living it and breathing it by setting boundaries and by focusing on her own well-being and those around her. So I think I'm not a mental health practitioner. I happen to be married to one, but I do think that, to my mind, a crisis is a significant stress. And resiliency is about coping with stress in a very positive way. And I think, each of us, as we go through our day and as we experience this very difficult stress on each of us personally, on our families, on our colleagues, we have to ask, how are we doing? How are we experiencing this? I don't know about everyone else on this call, but I have 2 school-age children, and that has added, an incredible complexity to the last 4 months. So you ask, are we working at home or living at work? Well, we're working and living in school at home. And that is just really tough. So I think as I think about resiliency, think about all the ways that each of us in our organizations can cope with the stress. In the beginning, we were very quick to focus on, let's keep everyone safe. And that means be at home. Let's not have them commute. Let's not have them be around other people. Let's just get everyone physically safe. Great. It turns out they all have to be mentally safe too, right? We also have to make sure that we have compassion for the fact that many people have suddenly experienced food insecurity, or that they have kids at home and they don't have the help that they had before, or they're worried about their family members. So there are lots of practices that I think many of us do. So exercise, you heard, regular schedules, meditation, other very helpful practices that can be very focusing and can reframe our situation and say, what are the opportunities here? I mean, one of the things that I think you heard Frank say before really resonated with me, which is that I want to come through this on the other side and say, I personally and my organization, we're better than we were before. We would never have wished this, but we're going to grow. We're going to grow in terms of how we care about each other, how we take care of each other. And I'll give you one specific example. We were having an all-staff meeting, about 100 people on a Zoom call, and suddenly someone took the liberty of sharing a personal experience. They said, I really miss my mother. My mother's older and I haven't been able to go visit her. And someone else shared, I'm really struggling with something. And at the end, it really choked me up. And I said, all of us, I feel closer to all of you today than at any time when we were all together. Isn't it ironic that we had to get further apart from each other to get closer? And the question is, how will we leverage this? How will we leverage this crisis so that we can be better as individuals and as organizations? And it's not just, leaning on our social network and cultivating our friendships and finding ways to laugh in the middle of it. You mentioned the irony of Anne blocking off 12 to 1, except for today. Well, guess where I am? I'm on vacation. And I specifically said to everyone on my team, I want you to take vacations. I want you to, and here I am working, because part of me thinks this is fun. So
yeah, I think I owe you, David, quite a bit. I think I owe Ann as well. It's the undercurrent message here. No, I think that's really helpful. My observation there, if I might chime in, is that your story about your team sharing stories and you opening up that space to allow them to share stories is important. Oftentimes, there's a whole conversation that we can have on empathy and the empathetic leader. And there's a whole debate, quite frankly, that we can have on that. But I think in this situation, the balance between realizing that you can be empathetic, right? You can be understanding to the degree that you described in your example, and at the same time be a strong leader, right? That is not easy, but there's a balance there that I think is important as we sustain ourselves and sustain our teams and realize that it's not just that we're working from home, but we're still working the same, right? It's not that. Everything is different in our physical space is home now, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that everything around us is changing constantly. Everything in our work environment is changing. So, again, kudos to you for allowing that space. And I think it's a great example of how we should emulate behavior. There is a question I want to pose to the panel that's come through the chat group. And it's around, I think it's a really interesting question, right? It's what are the lessons that are being learned right now through the crisis that are not just related, and I'm translating, so pardon the person who's asked the question, but I'm translating it a little bit. It's not just related to what are the lessons learned right now to react to the crisis, but what are the lessons being learned right now, and what are the actions that should ensue from those lessons that will be sustainable post-crisis? I think it's a fantastic question. Anne, might I turn to you for maybe a couple of thoughts or examples that you might have?
Yeah, I think I've gotten this question a lot over the last few weeks, and from my perspective, there are a lot of, I think, there are an amazing number of lessons to be learned here. I think in all of my life, I think arguably this has been the biggest collective learning moment in decades. Just when you think you have all the facts and the data to take a decision, they've changed. So you've got to be really quite flexible in that regard. Certainly, I think what we've learned is that more work can be done remotely than what we thought would be the case. I've learned that there are tools out there that enable that, digital tools that allow now remote innovation, remote collaboration, remote productivity. And I think you can't just introduce those tools. The workforce needs to know how to use the tools. You guys will probably laugh at me, but I was on a Teams call the other day, and they said, well, use the vote, go into the vote feature. And I was so embarrassed because I didn't know where it was, because, we just kind of all had to learn on our own while doing the day job. So I think the learning around that is really important. The other thing I've learned, though, from remote work, which I think we will see more of in the future. I don't think all work will go remotely. Some industries lend itself more so than others. But I think, the data, while people are enjoying remote work, there's a lot of data out there that says a lot of people want to come back. The stats vary based on what study, but roughly 50% can't wait to come back. I miss my colleagues. I can't wait to come back. Even the ones I didn't like so much, I miss. I mean, I just really miss my team members. I say that with jest. We have seen, and there's data out there, and I think E&Y actually put a report out there. The number of meetings has increased 23%. The number of after-hours emails up 20-some%. 34% increase in the length of the workday. Interrupted time has increased 34%, which means your ability to focus is down roughly 30%. 70% of professionals say it has been the most stressful time in their professional lives. We're seeing, and I don't know if you guys are seeing the same, vacation usage is down, because folks are saying, I don't want to take vacation to, go from my front door to my back door. I'm going to save it. And so all of this, from my perspective, says that the mental wellness of our workforce right now is absolutely critical, and I think it's fragile. And I think it's more fragile than we even, it's definitely more fragile than what we see, because people are not telling you or showing you how they feel. But all you need to do as a leader is ask someone, David, you pointed it out, ask someone, how are you feeling? And I always put today, because I guarantee you I'm feeling different today than I will tomorrow. It's just the up and down nature of this. And depending on the day, you hear a lot, and a lot of people go direct to their heart, and they say, I miss my mom. They say, my grandma died last week from COVID. They're putting their hearts out there. And I think that requires, getting back to the question, that requires a new sort of leadership going forward. The authentic leader, the vulnerable leader, the leader that's able to say, this is how I feel. This is how I set boundaries. And it's okay to set boundaries, and it's okay to talk about missing my mom or my dad. And I think the leaders that can do that, or can learn to do that in a natural, non-forced way, are going to be the ones that will have followership in this uncertain environment, especially in this uncertain environment and into the future.
Thank you so much, Anne. Frank, building on that, in a related, I'm combining about two questions that have come through the Zoom chat, but it sort of tags on to the thoughts that Anne provided. Most organizations have a sense of purpose, right? And have created a sense of purpose pre-COVID. How do you continue to align people to a sense of purpose? And again, I'm going to use the U.S. as an example, and with apologies to our global participants. How do you rally around a sense of purpose and continue to rally around an organizational sense of purpose for the future when we're in the situation with no foreseeable end in sight? Yeah,
so many of the things that we've talked about obviously are threaded together. And we talked about the time itself that we're in, and the best way I can describe it is just heavy, right? There's just a heaviness that we're all dealing with right now. And it's almost impossible to separate what we've dealt with from the COVID crisis to what's been going on from an anti-racism perspective at the same time, right? Which adds to that level of heaviness, but in the same way that we talked about the silver linings, creates this opportunity for change, right? And I think those organizations that really emerge from this as the winners will be the ones who have proactively embraced this as a moment to be reflective about all of this and to start to operate differently in a very deliberate way. And I think purpose is something many organizations talk about, and in their hearts of their people, the purpose that's most connected to what they do as a business, I think, is strong, but their greater societal impact is not as strong as many organizations would like it to be. And I think it's the opportunity for organizations to reflect on that during this time to gather people together to talk about what they could be doing to have a greater societal impact, and just start to do that, right? And so I think about some of the things at EY, and we're having really deliberate conversations now for what our learnings look like coming out of all this, and what we want our blueprint for the future to look like, and purpose is at the heart of that. And that is certainly aligning with the purposes of our clients, but anti-racism, we're taking a stronger stance on than we've ever taken before, and being much more assertive in the space we want to step into there. And we're engaging people in a way that we probably haven't in the past. And I think whatever those issues are for organizations, now is an opportunity where people want to have a positive impact, and trying to get a collective voice around what that should be, and to drive to the action that you think you can take, I think isn't just good in the short term. I think it's a long-term winning proposition for organizations, because I think they are going to get a greater share of hearts and minds than our other organizations that don't step into this space right now.
Great, thanks, Frank. I want to pick up on a thread that started as well, and David, turn that to you, which is around this aspect of mental well-being. And I know, from a practitioner standpoint, that's not what you did your fellowship in, David. But what are like 2 or 3 things, right? As we work with our teams, as we work in this virtual environment, what are 2 or 3 things tangibly, David, that you can provide us as tips in terms of how do we continue to sustain an environment of mental well-being, not only for ourselves, which Anne walked us through, but how do we infuse that into our virtual teams?
Vic, I think it's a really good question, and I think we've heard a number of potential answers here today that I think we could model. The first is about inquiry, asking how people are. That there's part of that is just the openness and authenticity that you've heard about. And I think there have been a number of comments in the chat about this idea of a growth mindset versus a performance mindset. And I think asking questions is really a part of that, is really saying, tell me about you, tell me about how you're doing, tell me about what are you challenged by during this opportunity, where have you seen opportunities? Another really is to focus on the work and what needs to get done, rather than the time and one of the things we noticed is that attendance at meetings was actually far better in this virtual space. People could come. They didn't have to worry about commuting across town. They didn't, they weren't being pulled from it. 12 to 1, 1 to 2, whatever it was. We don't want to talk about the lunch hour, but 1 to 2, people were there and they were present, and they might be even less distracted and more engaged than they were before. So I think identifying asking what are people's challenges, identifying where there are distractors, what are their competing responsibilities at home with family, and then finding ways to solve around those. And then maybe the last thing, this idea that that we can work well together at a distance. I think it is, what does team mean when you're interacting solely virtually? I've heard it over and over again when I ask people, what can't you do at home that you could do in the office? Every single person says the same thing. It's just the ability to tap this person on the shoulder and ask them a quick question. So as we heard from Anne, there are lots of great technology platforms out there. We've got Slack, and we've got Teams, and we've got Zoom, and we've got all this sort of stuff. But we have to think about what that means to use those. Somebody said to me, when you're using Slack, there is this tendency to just get very transactional. I just need this piece of information. Whereas when you're in the office, you might say, hey, how are your kids doing? And by the way, I need this piece of information. So we have to think about what it means to be a team when we're all remote, and how we can support each other. And so, for instance, I'll give you another example. We've started doing just pure social get-togethers for work. because we do enjoy spending time with each other. And we learned, we had a session that was all about each other's recommendations for movies and books and this and that. And it was great. I learned a ton from my colleagues. I've watched episodes of some crazy Irish cooking show that I never heard of because of my friends, my colleagues. So I think that's the way I think we can make the best of this. I'll leave you with this, maybe this one other idea. I think we need to have, and maybe this is growth mindset said in a different way. I think we need to have a systematic sense of skepticism. And that systematic sense is it can always be done better, right? If I had asked you, Anne, at your company, could you take everyone remote in 24 hours, in 36? If I had asked you that a year ago, you would have said, no, we have to form a committee. We have to we have to create policies and standards. Well, guess what? Everyone just did it. And we experienced that, and it has been unbelievably free to say we could do it better.
That's,
Hey, David, sorry, Vic, just real quick comment on that. When we talk about silver lining, the agility of the workforce that we've seen through this period of time is something we can't lose. We have to figure out how do we capitalize on that agility, because we've seen it like we've never seen it, in my working time. And if we somehow lose that muscle memory on the back end of this, what a shame it will have all been.
Yeah, that's what when we interact with companies today and we're helping them design, their interactions with health and healthcare for the future, that's what they're asking us. Healthcare and health is evolving beyond exponentially, right? So they want to understand, how do we plan for this? How do we think about it? How do we remain agile in this crazy environment? That's where we're at.
Great dialogue, great thoughts, David. Thank you. Just to switch gears real quick, Anne, from an inclusion perspective, as we think about the return to work environment, whenever that is, for those cohorts that are at a higher risk, or perhaps those cohorts that raise their hand and say, I just don't feel comfortable coming into the work environment. What are your sort of thought process around that? And I know you yourself, knowing you as a leader, are very proactive in some of these thinkings. Has BMS given that some thought, and what would be some of your recommendations to us around that?
Yeah, this one was fluid, and we were concerned what that would look like as we started to bring our workforce back. And again, our manufacturing workforce is back. Our lab workers are coming back now in phases. And employees would bring this up in our global town halls because they're worried, right? Like I take care of my grandmother, I take care of my sick mother, I don't want to go into work and bring it back, or I have a medical condition and I don't really want to tell you what it is, nor should they. And so we started to get this question. And so what I called around to my peers, because I leverage my network, right? I need the brains of everyone else, and everyone else was at the same place. We were like, not sure how big of an issue it's going to be or whatnot. So there was a question that came up on the chat that John asked me about, what did we learn from China? And China helped us kind of resolve this, because when this was hitting the United States, it was starting to move out of China, right? So we kept talking to our markets, and one of the lessons we learned from China was they thought that would be a significant issue. And as they started to bring their teams back to Shanghai, which is where we're at, our office-based location, one of several, they did have cases where employees were worried because of family or whatnot, and they talked through how they resolved those. So what that helped us appreciate is that inclusion is super important and needs to be respected. It's a value in our company, and that everyone's situation is unique and different. And don't forget that for 1 second. So you have to start with that foundation. We've created a very small, nimble, global, what we call a triage team, that has representation from our medical department to preserve confidentiality and privacy. And as we're bringing the workforce back, we're saying, if you have a concern or an issue, just let your leader or manager know that you have a concern or an issue. If you're comfortable sharing that with him or her, that's okay. You're not required. But we have this triage team. It's not the best name, but it's the name it got. We have this triage team. Here's how you access that. And I can tell you the triage team works with the manager and works with the employee, works with our medical organization. And I can say we have been able to, through our flexible policies that we have in place, through safety measures we have in place, just various flexible work options, we've been able to find a solution for nearly all of them. And there have not been very many. Now I say that with the caveat that, you know, our workforce is not back in totality. And I'm sure when we bring more back, these cases will escalate. But I think the name of the game here is flexibility and agility. We don't want to lose not one member of our talented team. So we're going to do everything we can to flex to try to accommodate that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ann. I want to be respectful of time. So one quick question, David, I'll start with you. And I'm rolling up, my apologies to the participants, I'm rolling up a couple of questions that have come through into one, which is picking up on this topic of mental well-being, and how do we, to Frank's point, how do we sustain our focus on mental well-being, which has occurred in a reaction to the crisis primarily? How do we sustain that long beyond the crisis being over? And in addition, I'm going to tuck into that and, you know, the rigor and discipline which you identified, but someone's come back with a question, which I think is a valid question, which is around how do I walk away when I feel that I have too much on my plate? I have this, you know, affiliation to making sure that I can do what I need to do. So I'm going to roll those two questions up. And David, maybe if I could get your just initial sort of reactions to that, and then Ann, very quickly from you, and then I'd like to round off the discussion.
So Vic, I think that that question is the key here. I think, I don't know anyone in my organization, we have about 125 people, we're a small shop, but I don't know anyone who doesn't want us to succeed and doesn't want to work incredibly hard and pull their weight. And so now there's this sense of, oh my goodness, there's so much work. I have to keep going. I have to be up at late at night, and there are emails and this sort of thing. And there is this overwhelming sense of, if I don't do it, no one else will. And I think we have to model it as leaders. We have to try to take vacations. We have to try to set boundaries. We have to stay healthy ourselves, and we have to encourage everyone to do that. I shared a humorous cartoon that I always, I've seen it over and over again in many ways. The idea of two people pushing a cart filled with round wheels, and the cart they're pushing has square wheels, right? And the idea is, no, you know, I don't have time to stop and, you know, think about that, because I've got to just keep pushing the cart with the square wheels. And sometimes I think if we can get the message out that taking a break and sharpening your saw, which is taking care of yourself, is the best way to keep going. And this has to be a message that people hear over and over again. They have to be incentivized. They have to be rewarded for this approach. And in terms of the question of what do we, you know, how do we make mental health a focus? I think there is financial incentive for every single person on this call to think about this and to think about the mental health of their employees, because the reality is that depression, anxiety, they've always been there, and they take away from our ability to get work done. And so we have to address this. They can't be, there can't be stigma associated with it. These are diseases. These are our problems. I mean, having anxiety about coronavirus may well be a very reasonable anxiety. How many people know someone who said, you know, people used to think I was crazy because I washed my fruits and vegetables. Now look, see, now they're telling me to do that, right? I think the reality is we have to bring these issues front and center. We've put together a tremendous number of resources about stress and resiliency and anxiety and depression. And I would encourage people to look at it. And if you have questions, please email me. I know we don't have time to go into it in detail.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so just being respectful of time, under the sort of spirit of the human element, and I'm going to start with you. What is one, and then David, and then Frank, please. And what's one thing that you learned about yourself over the last couple of months through this crisis?
I've learned a lot of things about myself. The one that just pops in my head is, I would leading with my head and my heart. And I've, through 30 years of practice, I've kind of been trained to lead with head, lead with data. That's how you influence. And I've really turned the heart up in the last few months. And I think it's served us well, and it's helped to kind of tease out some of those mental wellness challenges that we're talking about in the workforce. The workforce needs right now authentic, vulnerable leadership. And I'm not saying weak leadership. I actually think leaders that are authentic and vulnerable are your strongest leaders. The other advice that I'm practicing right now is, it comes from my dad, but I'm sure it's not my dad's quote, but he's a farmer in Iowa. It's to talk less and to listen more. And Dad always says, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. And I've learned, ask the question and then just shut up and listen for understanding, and then move forward from there.
It's great sage advice. Thank you. And David, in a minute or so, what's one learning that you'd like to share?
I love what Ann said, and I truly share all those ideas. I would say there have been a few things that have really struck me. First is that in some way there has been a transition back to simplicity and focus that has happened during this period of time. This idea of, I've got 2 little kids and they've got 1,000 appointments and teams and this and that, and it's all stopped. And we've focused on family and dinner and being together and coping and talking with them about what it means to overcome challenges. And I listened to that. There's a podcast called How I Built This with Guy Raz. And there was a great one recently where he interviewed Danny Meyer, who's a restaurateur who's really been through some challenges now. And he said, he started by telling a story about his grandfather who said, no one should complain about problems. Problems are business, and how you solve those problems and how you solve them better, and by surrounding yourself by good people who want to solve those problems, that's what business is about. And so I would say that I have been just so proud and impressed by the people who I work with, who, as you said, agile, they changed instantly. They said, well, we can do it better. We can do this differently. We'll find a solution. And that's amazing. And it has really inspired me to see our whole operation in a completely different way. And that's been great.
Just in the interest of time, I know we're right at the hour, and I know people have packed schedules, so I'm going to just thank our really esteemed panelists. I know myself, I've just learned so much in the last hour, and I mean that as authentically as I possibly can. So, Ann, thank you so much for your insights, your stories. David, you as well. Frank, of course, thank you for making time out of your busy schedule. And last but not least, all of our participants, thank you for joining us. I know our days are busy, but you taking an hour out of your day to join us in this dialogue and your dialogue in the chat function, so appreciative. Stay well, be well, and we'll speak soon. Thanks again.